Welcome to ADF TV. My name is Frank Nimphius and I'm from the Oracle JDeveloper and ADF Product Management team. In the previous two recordings I talked about MDS and I did so in the context of customization and personalization. In this session now we talk about the infrastructure that you would need to put this into production. Well, first of all, there are two choices for you. One is a file-based repository and the other one is a database repository that would hold the change metadata. So everything that's different from the base application. Now the file-based repository is good to use for development, and in JDeveloper it's the only choice you have. Still, you can use this on a standalone WebLogic server, but would it scale? Would it really help running a big application? Surely not. Here the recommendation is use a database-based repository, and for this you need the repository creation utility, or in short RCU, which is a separate download from OTN. Now you can install this RCU utility or the repository into an Oracle or non-Oracle database, and you can have as many repositories as you want in a database. It's not just a single repository that fits in a database, there are many. The WebLogic server that hosts the application will have to be configured to access that repository. And again, the WebLogic server can hook up to different repositories so that it's not that a WebLogic server can only connect to one repository, and for that reason a specific type of application has to run on a specific domain of WebLogic server. So here you have a many-to-many option that you should use. For performance, the recommendation is that the database and the WebLogic server are not too far away from each other so that you're not suffering from any kind of network latency. The architecture topic to bring across here is the notion of partition. Now a repository can be partitioned, and you can imagine as a partition as a naming space or as a stripe that holds metadata for a specific purpose. And though a partition could hold the metadata for different applications, we recommend for ease of administration to have it one-to-one. So one partition should just hold the metadata of one application, and to be more precise, it should only hold the metadata of one version of your application. So if you have different versions of your application, then what you shouldn't do is you shouldn't mix and match. You should keep the metadata separate. And for this you have the option to import, export or to clone stripes of your repository using Enterprise Manager. And this makes administration kind of easy, declarative, but also allows you to go very flexible with the architecture that you use for customization and personalization. For the deployment, well, first of all, the enabling of customization is configured in the ADF config file, so it's at design time. So you cannot enable an application for customization at runtime. I talked about this on the previous recording where I said, okay, when you enable seeded customization, there's a change in the ADF config, and that exactly will set up the application for customization. That needs to be done at design time. Now, when you deploy the application, there are customers that deploy the application using JDeveloper, fair enough, but then in JDeveloper you have to wire up the MDS enabled application with a repository. So you will have a WebLogic server connection, and upon deployment we'll say, okay, this WebLogic server knows about this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 repositories, and that is the repository my application should write to and read from. For those that use other deployment mechanisms, they do have the WebLogic server scripting facility for MDS or Enterprise Manager to connect an application with its repository. The deployment of metadata, of the change data, especially if it's seeded customization, that goes into a metadata archive file which is called the MAR file, and that has to be deployed with the application as part of the EAR file. Now I mentioned that one of the requirements for an application or for customization, and I did mention this in the previous recording, is performance, scalability, ease of administration. Now for performance, caching is a key ingredient here, and the cache that we have in metadata services works as an object cache in memory, and it works on a specific virtual machine. So a WebLogic server domain is a virtual machine, so every application instance that runs on that domain will participate from one instance of the cache. And remember what I talked about when I referred about seated customization, where I said that customization layers could be flagged as individual customizations or group customizations. Now, if it's a group customization, then the more frequent customization is pulled out of the repository based on the setting that it's a group customization, it will stay in the cache, and therefore you gain much better performance because it's not just requeried all the time, it's just read from the cache. Also, you have the ability to configure the cache, not only for the initial size of the cache, which you can do in ADF config, you can also use Enterprise Manager to configure the metadata repository to set, for instance, the frequency in which the overall cache should be purged and renewed, or to shrink the database usage, for which you can use scripts. So there's a lot of administration around it, which goes beyond of the recording that we have here. And I recommend that you keep on reading the administration guides that come with WebLogic Server and that contain MDS. So it's Fusion middleware that you want to look for. Question now, how many repositories do you need? Well, for ADF the answer is simple, right? I could have one repository with a lot of stripes in there, but what if you use SOA suite? What if you use BPM and WebCenter in combination with ADF? Well, both are customers to MDS as well, so they will write by default into a repository. So how many repositories do you need? Do you want to have one? Well, there's no single answer to that, and it's completely up to you and completely up to your requirements. Now, do you need to maintain different versions of your applications? Do you plan for different patch sets? So that's all up to you. However, as there is no hard rule, there's a strategy to share, and that is what I'm doing on the next slide. It's not the only single answer to the infrastructure setup, but it's just a little bit of guidance, and you might like it, and if you like it, maybe implement it. So first of all, the infrastructure decision that you have to do has to aim for ease of administration, maximum flexibility, and of course performance. Well, many small repositories of course are easier to administer and most likely scale a lot better than one big monolithic repository. And while you can have many repositories in a single database, still that is a question of infrastructure cost versus administration or maintenance cost. So that's all up to you. So what you really want to do is, when you build an application, your custom application, no matter if it's uses WebCenter or not, it will come with versions because you continue building your application. To some point you might have a change that requires you to count up the version number of your own application. Now, if all of the metadata is in the same repository, the same partition, you might struggle in that a change doesn't work with a specific version of your application. So for that reason, plan that into your infrastructure considerations and have versions of your application in their own stripe or in their own partitions. So there's also, and I mentioned that, a dependency to the different Fusion middleware releases. Now just let me give you one example. Say your application is built with a specific version of Fusion middleware, say 11.1.1.4. And now for whatever reason you have to upgrade your ADF application to 11.1.1.7, but because of resources, time constraints or whatever, you cannot upgrade SOA and WebCenter. You see the dependency here. So while in theory, for instance, the SOA bits would work with an ADF lifted up to a new patch set version, you cannot do the same on the SOA infrastructure. So keeping them separate, the SOA infrastructure in their own repository and the ADF parts in their own repository, will give you the flexibility to upgrade one without upgrading the other. So that's one of the dependencies as well. So if you look into that, then that is something that you want to consider. Same for decommissioning an application. So you might have an application that you want to no longer use, so you want to get rid of that and purge all of the metadata. Now if you have a clean, strict separation, then it wouldn't do any harm to any other installed product. So keep SOA bits, WebCenter bits and ADF bits in their own repository. So that's the best way you can isolate that. So that gets us to our recommendation, and the recommendation is more like a pattern. So first of all, use the database repository, because the database repository is really what makes sense for production environments. So unless you write something like hello world where you can still keep on going with a file-based system, just use the production system on a database-driven repository. Then use different repositories for development, QA and production. And it all makes sense because it could happen that during development there are some changes that are not meant to go into production, or in QA you're just adding customization fragments during the testing process that you don't want to have to end up into the production system. So you want to keep them on separate repositories. Now you may have different versions of the application. Let's take the Fusion Order demo. So you might have a FOD1 on the ADF application, a FOD2 and a FOD3. And all of these will have equivalent QA and development copies as well as a production copy. So what you would do is you want to keep the QA and the development copies in separate repositories, but then the different versions as partitions in the same repository. And remember, a partition can be cloned, a partition can be deleted, it can be exported, it can be imported with Enterprise Manager. So that gives you maximum flexibility. And then create distinct repositories, as I recommended 2 minutes ago, for different Fusion middleware components that you're using, like WebCenter or SOA, just for the sake of not creating a dependency between the state of a specific ADF application version to the other bits like the SOA BPM processes that you maintain and you want to run. So that gets us to, and I mentioned that before, this little pattern that we want to recommend. So create kind of a template for application MDS repositories. So look in your infrastructure. So you use SOA, one repository. Use MDS, another repository. You use application and WebCenter, just all repositories. So once you have the number of repositories, that is what we would call just the MDS infrastructure. So you create instances of these MDS repositories. So these kind of duplicates, one for development, one for testing, and one for production. And this is where you have the different versions in it. So the version 1 of your application, version 2 of your application will all end up in partitions. And then you would just duplicate this infrastructure for every Fusion middleware version or patch set. Well, that sounds really expensive what I'm suggesting here, but that is just tailored for maximum flexibility and cutting all the dependencies that you could have. Now, in your real production environment, you might not have a dependency to WebCenter, or you want to plan to have the WebCenter bits and the ADF application bits always upgraded to the same Fusion middleware release, in which case you don't need to keep them necessarily separate. And remember that a repository could live in a database that holds other repositories as well. So it's just this flexibility, and this is just one of the patterns. So this is the pattern what I would call maximum flexibility. But there could also be a pattern called meet in the middle, where then the agreement is that you always lift up, when you upgrade the ADF application, you lift up the other dependent bits, SOA or WebCenter, to the same release of Fusion middleware, in which case you don't need to have this extra repository created there. So that was all to say about infrastructure. It's just a brief introduction. As I mentioned, there's Fusion middleware documentation. You should have a look up and read into administration topics for metadata services. Keep in mind, ADF uses metadata services for customization and personalization, but other products do it as well. So this is why you have to think about the deployment infrastructure. If you're an ISV, if you're selling your application, your software, then the more likely you will go for fine-grained maximum control deployment topologies in contrast to this one monolithic repository that always causes, because of the dependencies, that you will have to upgrade everything at the same time.